Side 2. My Adventure in Norfolk by A.J. Allen. I don't know how it is with you, but during February, my wife generally says to me, "Have you thought at all about what we're going to do for August?" And of course, I say, no. And then she begins looking through the advertisements for bungalows to let. Well, this happened last year, as usual, and she eventually produced one that looked possible. It said, Norfolk, Hickling Broad, furnished bungalow, garden, garage, boathouse, and all the rest of it. Oh, and plate and linen. It also mentioned an exorbitant rent. I pointed out the bit about the rent, but my wife said, "Yes, you'll have to go down and see the landlord and get him to come down. They always do." As a matter of fact, they always don't, but that's a detail. Anyway, I wrote off to the landlord and asked if he could arrange for me to stay the night in the place, to see what it was really like. He wrote back and said, certainly, and that he was engaging Mrs. So-and-so to come in and oblige me and make up the beds and so forth. I tell you, we do things thoroughly in our family. I have to sleep in all the beds, and when I come home, my wife counts the bruises and decides whether they will do or not. At any rate, I arrived in a blinding snowstorm at about the most desolate spot on God's earth. I'd come to Potter Heigham by train and been driven on. It was a good 5 miles from the station. Fortunately, Mrs. Selston, the old lady who was going to do for me, was there, and she'd lighted a fire and cooked me a steak, for which I was truly thankful. I somehow think the cow, or whatever they get steaks off, had only died that morning. It was very, obstinate. While I dined, she talked to me. She would tell me all about an operation her husband had just had. All about it. It was almost a lecture on surgery. The steak was rather underdone, and it made me sort of feel I was illustrating her lecture. Anyway, she put me clean off my dinner, and then departed for the night. I explored the bungalow and just had a look outside. It was, of course, very dark, but not snowing quite so hard. The garage stood about 15 yards from the back door. I walked round it, but didn't go in. I also went down to the edge of the Broad and verified the boathouse. The whole place looked as though it might be all right in the summertime, but just then it made one wonder why people ever wanted to go to the North Pole. Anyhow, I went indoors and settled down by the fire. You've no idea how quiet it was. Even the waterfowl had taken a night off. Well, at least they weren't working. At a few minutes to 11, I heard the first noise there'd been since Mrs. What's-her-name, Selston, had cleared out. It was the sound of a car. If it had gone straight by, I probably shouldn't have noticed it at all. Only it didn't go straight by. It seemed to stop farther up the road, before it got to the house. Even that didn't make much impression. After all, cars do stop. It must have been 5 or 10 minutes before it was borne in on me that it hadn't gone on again. So I got up and looked out of the window. It had left off snowing, and there was a glare through the gate that showed that there were headlamps somewhere just out of sight. I thought I might as well stroll out and investigate. I found a fair-sized limousine pulled up in the middle of the road about 20 yards short of my gate. The light was rather blinding, but when I got close to it, I found a girl with the bonnet open, tinkering with the engine. Quite an attractive young female from what one could see, but she was so muffled up in furs that it was rather hard to tell. I said, good evening. Anything I can do?" She said she didn't know what was the matter. The engine had just stopped and wouldn't start again. And it had. It wouldn't even turn, either with the self-starter or the handle. The whole thing was awfully hot. And I asked her whether there was any water in the radiator. She didn't see why there shouldn't be. There always had been. This didn't strike me as entirely conclusive. I said we'd better put some in and see what happened. She said, "Why not use snow?" But I thought not. There was an idea at the back of my mind that there was some reason why it was unwise to use melted snow, and it wasn't until I arrived with a bucketful that I remembered what it was. Of course, goiter. When I got back to her, she'd got the radiator cap off and inserted what a Danish friend of mine calls a funeral. We poured a little water in, Luckily, I'd warned her to stand clear. The first tablespoonful that went in came straight out again, red hot, and blew the funeral sky high. We waited a few minutes until things had cooled down a bit, but it was no go. As fast as we poured water in, it simply ran out again into the road underneath. It was quite evident that she'd been driving with the radiator bone dry, and that her engine had seized right up. I told her so. She said, "Does that mean I've got to stop here all night?" I explained that it wasn't as bad as all that. That is, if she cared to accept the hospitality of my poor roof. And it was a poor roof. It let the water in. But she wouldn't hear of it. By the by, she didn't know the circumstances, so it wasn't that. No, she wanted to leave the car where it was and go on foot. I said, "Don't be silly. It's miles to anywhere." However, at that moment we heard a car coming along the road, the same way she'd come. We could see its lights too, though it was a very long way off. You know how flat Norfolk is. You can see a terrific distance. I said, "There's the way out of all your troubles. This thing, whatever it is, will give you a tow to the nearest garage, or at any rate a lift to some hotel." One would have expected her to show some relief, but she didn't. I began to wonder what she jolly well did want. She wouldn't let me help her to stop where she was, and she didn't seem anxious for anyone to help her to go anywhere else. She was quite peculiar about it. She gripped hold of my arm and said, "What do you think this is that's coming?" I said, "Well, I'm sure I don't know, being a stranger in these parts, but it sounds like a lorry full of milk cans." I offered to lay her sixpence about it. This was before the betting tax came in. She'd have had to pay, too, because it was a lorry full of milk cans. The driver had to pull up because there wasn't room to get by. He got down and asked if there was anything he could do to help. We explained the situation. He said he was going to Norwich and was quite ready to give her a tow if she wanted it. However, she wouldn't do that, and it was finally decided to shove her car into my garage for the night, to be sent for next day, and the lorry was to take her along to Norwich. Well, I managed to find the key of the garage, and the lorry driver, Williams his name was, and I ran the car in and locked the door. This having been done, ablative absolute, I suggested that it was a very cold night. Williams agreed and said he didn't mind if he did. So I took them both indoors and mixed them a stiff whiskey and water each. There wasn't any soda. And naturally, the whole thing had left me very cold too. I hadn't an overcoat on. Up to now, I hadn't seriously considered the young woman. For one thing, it had been dark, and there had been a seized engine to look at. I'm afraid that's not a very gallant remark. What I mean is that to anyone with a mechanical mind, a motor car in that condition is much more interesting than... well, it is very interesting, but why labour the point? However, in the sitting room, in the lamplight, it was possible to get more of an idea. She was a little older than I'd thought, and her eyes were too close together. Of course, she wasn't a... how shall I put it? Her manners weren't quite easy, and she was careful with her English, you know. But that wasn't it. She treated us with a lack of friendliness which was... well, we'd done nothing to deserve it. There was a sort of vague hostility and suspicion, which seemed rather hard lines, considering. Also, she was so anxious to keep in the shadows that if I hadn't moved the lamp away, she'd never have got near the fire at all. And the way she hurried the wretched Williams over his drink was quite distressing, and foolish, too, as he was going to drive. But that was her funnel. When he'd gone out to start up his engine, I asked her if she was all right for money, and she apparently was. Then they started off, and I shut up the place and went upstairs. There happened to be a local guidebook in my bedroom with maps in it. I looked at these and couldn't help wondering where the girl in the car had come from. I mean, my road seemed so very unimportant. The sort of road one might use if one wanted to avoid people. If one were driving a stolen car, for instance. This was quite a thrilling idea. I thought it might be worthwhile having another look at the car. So I once more unhooked the key from the kitchen dresser and sallied forth into the snow. It was as black as pitch, and so still that my candle hardly flickered. It wasn't a large garage, and the car nearly filled it. By the by, we'd backed it in so as to make it easier to tow it out again. The engine I'd already seen, so I squeezed past along the wall and opened the door in the body part of the car. At least, I only turned the handle, and the door was pushed open from the inside, and something fell out on me. It pushed me quite hard and wedged me against the wall. It also knocked the candle out of my hand, which was a bit of a nuisance. I wondered what on earth the thing was, barging into me like that. So I felt it rather gingerly and found it was a man, a dead man, with a moustache. He'd evidently been sitting propped up against the door. I managed to put him back as decorously as possible and shut the door again. After a lot of grovelling about under the car, I found the candle and lighted it, and opened the opposite door and switched on the little lamp in the roof, and then... Of course, I had to make some sort of examination. He was an extremely tall and thin individual. He must have been well over 6'3". He was dark and very cadaverous looking. In fact, I don't suppose he'd ever looked so cadaverous in his life. He was wearing a trench coat. It wasn't difficult to tell what he died of. He'd been shot through the back. I found the hole just under the right scrofula or scalpel. What is shoulder blade, anyway? Oh, clavicle. Stupid of me. Well, that's where it was, and the bullet had evidently gone through into the lung. I say evidently, and leave it at that. There were no papers in his pockets, and no tailor's name in his clothes. But there was a note case with £9 in it. Altogether, a most unpleasant business. Of course, it doesn't do to question the workings of Providence, but one couldn't help wishing it hadn't happened. It was just a little mysterious, too. Who had killed him? It wasn't likely that the girl had, or she wouldn't have been joyriding about the country with him. And if someone else had murdered him, why hadn't she mentioned it? Well, anyway, she hadn't, and she'd gone. So one couldn't do anything for the time being. No telephone, of course. I just locked up the garage and went to bed. That was 2 o'clock. Next morning, I woke early for some reason or other, and it occurred to me as a good idea to go and have a look at things by daylight, and before Mrs. Selston turned up. So I did. The first thing that struck me was that it had snowed heavily during the night, because there were no wheel tracks or footprints. And the second was that I had left the key in the garage door. I opened it and went in. The place was completely empty. No car, no body, no nothing. There was a patch of grease on the floor where I'd dropped the candle. Otherwise, there was nothing to show I'd been there before. One of two things must have happened. Either some people had come along during the night and taken the car away, or else I'd fallen asleep in front of the fire and dreamt the whole thing. Then I remembered the whiskey glasses. They should still be in the sitting room. I went back to look, and they were, all three of them. So it hadn't been a dream, and the car had been fetched away, but they must have been jolly quiet over it. The girl had left her glass on the mantelpiece, and it showed several very clearly defined finger marks. Some were mine, naturally, because I'd fetched the glass from the kitchen and poured out the drink for her. But hers, her finger marks, were clean, and mine were oily, so it was quite easy to tell them apart. It isn't necessary to point out that this glass was very important. There'd evidently been a murder or something of that kind, and the girl must have known all about it, even if she hadn't actually done it herself. So anything she had left in the way of evidence ought to be handed over to the police. And this was all she had left. So I packed it up with meticulous care in an old biscuit box out of the larder. When Mrs. Selston came, I settled up with her and came back to town. Oh, I called on the landlord on the way and told him I'd let him know about the bungalow. Then I caught my train and in due course drove straight to Scotland Yard. I went up and saw my friend there. I produced the glass and asked him if his people could identify the marks. He said, "Well, probably not." But he sent it down to the fingerprint department and asked me where it came from. I said, "Never you mind. Let's have the identification first," he said. "All right." They're awfully quick, these people. The clerk was back in 3 minutes with a file of papers. They knew the girl all right. They told me her name and showed me her photograph. Not flattering. Quite an adventurous lady from all accounts. In the early part of her career, she'd done time twice for shoplifting, chiefly in the book department. Then she'd what they call taken up with a member of one of those race gangs one sometimes hears about. My pal went on to say that there'd been a fight between two of these gangs, in the course of which her friend had got shot. She'd managed to get him away in a car, but it had broken down somewhere in Norfolk. So she'd left it, and the dead man, in someone's garage, and had started off for Norwich in a lorry. Only she never got there. On the way, the lorry skidded, and both she and the driver, a fellow called Williams, had been thrown out, and they'd rammed their heads against a brick wall, which everyone knows is a fatal thing to do. At least it was in their case. I said, "Look here, it's all very well, but you simply can't know all this. There hasn't been time. It only happened last night." He said, "Last night be blowed. It all happened in February 1919. The people you've described have been dead for years." I said, "Oh, and to think, I might have stuck to that £9.
The Return of Imray by Rudyard Kipling. Imray achieved the impossible. Without warning, for no conceivable motive, in his youth, at the threshold of his career, he chose to disappear from the world, which is to say, the little Indian station where he lived. Upon a day he was alive, well, happy, and in great evidence among the billiard tables at his club. Upon a morning he was not, and no manner of search could make sure where he might be. He had stepped out of his place. He had not appeared at his office at the proper time, and his dog-cart was not upon the public roads. For these reasons, and because he was hampering in a microscopical degree the administration of the Indian Empire, that empire paused for one microscopical moment to make inquiry into the fate of Imray. Ponds were dragged, wells were plumbed, telegrams were dispatched down the lines of railways and to the nearest seaport town, 1,200 miles away, but Imray was not at the end of the drag ropes nor the telegraph wires. He was gone, and his place knew him no more. Then the work of the great Indian Empire swept forward, because it could not be delayed, and Imray, from being a man, became a mystery, such a thing as men talk over at their tables in the club for a month, and then forget utterly. His guns, horses, and carts were sold to the highest bidder, and his bungalow stood empty. After 3 or 4 months of the scorching hot weather had gone by, my friend Strickland, of the police, saw fit to rent the bungalow from the native landlord. Strickland's life was sufficiently peculiar, and men complained of his manners and customs. There was always food in his house, but there were no regular times for meals. He ate, standing up and walking about, whatever he might find at the sideboard, and this is not good for human beings. His domestic equipment was limited to 6 rifles, 3 shotguns, 5 saddles, and a collection of stiff-jointed mahseer rods, bigger and stronger than the largest salmon rod. These occupied half of his bungalow, and the other half was given up to Strickland and his dog, Tietjens, an enormous rampur slut who devoured daily the ration of 2 men. She spoke to Strickland in a language of her own, and whenever, walking abroad, she saw things calculated to destroy the peace of Her Majesty the Queen Empress, she returned to her master and laid information. Strickland would take steps at once, and the end of his labours was trouble and fine and imprisonment for other people. The natives believed that Tietjens was a familiar spirit, and treated her with the great reverence that is born of hate and fear. One room in the bungalow was set apart for her special use. She owned a bedstead, a blanket, and a drinking trough, and if anyone came into Strickland's room at night, her custom was to knock down the invader and give tongue until someone came with a light. Strickland owed his life to her when he was on the frontier in search of a local murderer who came in the grey dawn to send Strickland much further than the Andaman Islands. Tietjens caught the man as he was crawling into Strickland's tent with a dagger between his teeth, and after his record of iniquity was established in the eyes of the law, he was hanged. From that date, Tietjens wore a collar of rough silver and employed a monogram on her night blanket, and the blanket was of double-woven cashmere cloth, for she was a delicate dog. A short time after Strickland had taken Imray's bungalow, my business took me through that station, and naturally, the club quarters being full, I quartered myself upon Strickland. It was a desirable bungalow, 8-roomed and heavily thatched against any chance of leakage from rain. Under the pitch of the roof ran a ceiling cloth, which looked just as neat as a whitewashed ceiling. The landlords had repainted it when Strickland took the bungalow. Unless you knew how Indian bungalows were built, you would never have suspected that above the cloth lay the dark, three-cornered cavern of the roof, where the beams and the underside of the thatch harboured all manner of rats, bats, ants, and foul things. Tietjens met me in the veranda with a bay like the boom of the bell of St. Paul's, putting her paws on my shoulder to show she was glad to see me. Strickland had contrived to claw together a sort of meal, which he called lunch, and immediately after it was finished, went out about his business. I was left alone with Tietjens and my own affairs. The heat of the summer had broken up and turned to the warm damp of the rains. There was no motion in the heated air, but the rain fell like ramrods on the earth and flung up a blue mist when it splashed back. The bamboo and the custard apples, the poinsettias and the mango trees in the garden stood still while the warm water lashed through them, and the frogs began to sing among the aloe hedges. A little before the light failed, and when the rain was at its worst, I sat in the back veranda and heard the water roar from the eaves, and scratched myself because I was covered with the thing called prickly heat. Tietjens came out with me and put her head in my lap and was very sorrowful. So I gave her biscuits when tea was ready, and I took tea in the back veranda on account of the little coolness found there. The rooms of the house were dark behind me. I could smell Strickland's saddlery and the oil on his guns, and I had no desire to sit among these things. My own servant came to me in the twilight, the muslin of his clothes clinging tightly to his drenched body, and told me that a gentleman had called and wished to see someone. Very much against my will, but only because of the darkness of the rooms, I went into the naked drawing-room, telling my man to bring the lights. There might or might not have been a caller waiting. It seemed to me that I saw a figure by one of the windows, but when the lights came on, there was nothing, save the spikes of the rain and the smell of the drinking earth in my nostrils. I explained to my servant that he was no wiser than he ought to be, and went back to the veranda to talk to Tietjens. She had gone out into the wet, and I could hardly coax her back to me, even with biscuits with sugar tops. Strickland came home, dripping wet, just before dinner, and the first thing he said was, "Has anyone called?" I explained, with apologies, that my servant had summoned me into the drawing-room on a false alarm, or that some loafer had tried to call on Strickland, and, thinking better of it, had fled after giving his name. Strickland ordered dinner without comment, and since it was a real dinner, with a white tablecloth attached, we sat down. At 9 o'clock, Strickland wanted to go to bed, and I was tired too. Tietjens, who had been lying underneath the table, rose up and swung into the least exposed veranda as soon as her master moved to his own room, which was set next to the stately chamber set apart for Tietjens. If a mere wife had wished to sleep out of doors in that pelting rain, it would not have mattered, but Tietjens was a dog, and therefore the better animal. I looked at Strickland, expecting to see him flay her with a whip. He smiled queerly, as a man would smile after telling some unpleasant domestic tragedy. "She has done this ever since I moved in here," said he. "Let her go." The dog was Strickland's dog, so I said nothing, but I felt all that Strickland felt in being thus made light of. Tietjens encamped outside my bedroom window, and storm after storm came up, thundered on the thatch, and died away. The lightning spattered the sky as a thrown egg spatters a barn door, but the light was pale blue, not yellow, and looking through my split bamboo blinds, I could see the great dog standing, not sleeping, in the veranda, and hackles alift on her back, and her feet anchored as tensely as the drawn wire rope of a suspension bridge. In the very short pauses of the thunder, I tried to sleep, but it seemed that someone wanted me very urgently. He, whoever he was trying to call me by name, but his voice was no more than a husky whisper. The thunder ceased, and Tietjens went into the garden and howled at the low moon. Somebody tried to open my door, walked about and about through the house, and stood breathing heavily in the verandas. And just when I was falling asleep, I fancied that I heard a wild hammering and clamouring above my head or on the door. I ran into Strickland's room and asked him whether he was ill and had been calling me. He was lying on his bed, half-dressed, a pipe in his mouth. "I thought you'd come," he said. "Have I been walking round the house recently?" I explained that he had been tramping in the dining room and the smoking room and 2 or 3 other places, and he laughed and told me to go back to bed. I went back to bed and slept till the morning, but through all my mixed dreams I was sure I was doing someone an injustice in not attending to his wants. What those wants were I could not tell, but a fluttering, whispering, bolt-fumbling, lurking, loitering someone was reproaching me for my slackness, and half awake I heard the howling of Tietjens in the garden and the threshing of the rain. I lived in that house for 2 days. Strickland went to his office daily, leaving me alone for 8 or 10 hours with Tietjens for my only companion. As long as the full light lasted, I was comfortable, and so was Tietjens. But in the twilight, she and I moved into the back veranda and cuddled each other for company. We were alone in the house, but nonetheless it was much too fully occupied by a tenant with whom I did not wish to interfere. I never saw him, but I could see the curtains between the rooms quivering where he had just passed through. I could hear the chairs creaking as the bamboos sprung under a weight that had just quitted them, and I could feel when I went to get a book from the dining room that somebody was waiting in the shadows of the front veranda till I should have gone away. Tietjens made the twilight more interesting by glaring into the darkened rooms with every hair erect and following the motions of something that I could not see. She never entered the rooms, but her eyes moved interestedly. That was quite sufficient. Only when my servant came to trim the lamps and make all light and habitable, she would come in with me, and spend her time sitting on her haunches, watching an invisible extra man as he moved about behind my shoulder. Dogs are cheerful companions. I explained to Strickland, gently as might be, that I would go over to the club and find for myself quarters there. "Stay on," he said, "and see what this thing means. All you have talked about I have known since I took the bungalow. Stay on and wait. Tietjens has left me. Are you going too?" Therefore, I explained more clearly than ever that I liked him immensely and would be happy to see him in the daytime, but that I did not care to sleep under his roof. This was after dinner, when Tietjens had gone out to lie in the veranda. "On my soul, I don't wonder," said Strickland, with his eyes on the ceiling cloth. "Look at that." The tails of 2 brown snakes were hanging between the cloth and the cornice of the wall. They threw long shadows in the lamplight. "If you're afraid of snakes, of course," said Strickland. I hate and fear snakes. You ought to get your thatch overhauled, I said. Give me a mahseer rod and we'll poke 'em down. They'll hide among the roof beams, said Strickland. I can't stand snakes overhead. I'm going up into the roof. If I shake 'em down, stand by with a cleaning rod and break their backs. I was not anxious to assist Strickland in his work, but I took the cleaning rod and waited in the dining room, while Strickland brought a gardener's ladder from the veranda and set it against the side of the room. The snake tails drew themselves up and disappeared. We could hear the dry, rushing scuttle of the long bodies running over the baggy ceiling cloth. Strickland took a lamp with him, while I tried to make clear to him the danger of hunting roof snakes between a ceiling cloth and a thatch, apart from the deterioration of property caused by ripping out ceiling cloths. Nonsense, said Strickland. They're sure to hide near the walls by the cloth. The bricks are too cold for 'em, and the heat of the room is just what they like. He put his hand to the corner of the stuff and ripped it from the cornice. It gave with a great sound of tearing, and Strickland put his head through the opening into the dark of the angle of the roof beams. I set my teeth and lifted the rod, for I had not the least knowledge of what might descend. Said Strickland, and his voice rolled and rumbled in the roof. There's room for another set of rooms up here, and by Jove, someone is occupying 'em. Snakes? I said from below. No, it's a buffalo. Hand me out the last 2 joints of a mahseer rod, and I'll prod it. It's lying on the main roof beam. I handed up the rod. What a nest for owls and serpents. No wonder the snakes live here, said Strickland, climbing further into the roof. I could see his elbow thrusting with the rod. Come out of that, whoever you are. Heads below there, it's falling. I saw the ceiling cloth nearly in the centre of the room sag with a shape that was pressing it downwards towards the lighted lamp on the table. I snatched the lamp out of danger and stood back. Then the cloth ripped out from the walls, tore, split, swayed, and shot down upon the table, something that I dared not look at, till Strickland had slid down the ladder and was standing by my side. He did not say much, being a man of few words, but he picked up the loose end of the tablecloth and threw it over the remnants on the table. It strikes me, said he, putting down the lamp, our friend Imray has come back. Oh, you would you? There was a movement under the cloth, and a little snake wriggled out, to be back broken by the butt of the mahseer rod. I was sufficiently sick to make no remarks worth recording. Strickland meditated and helped himself to drinks. The arrangement under the cloth made no more signs of life. Is it Imray? I said. Strickland turned back the cloth for a moment and looked. It is Imray, he said, and his throat is cut from ear to ear. Then we spoke, both together and to ourselves. That's why he whispered about the house. Tietjens in the garden began to bay furiously. A little later, her great nose heaved open the dining-room door. She sniffed and was still. The tattered ceiling cloth hung down almost to the level of the table, and there was hardly room to move away from the discovery. Tietjens came in and sat down, her teeth bared under her lip and her forepaws planted. She looked at Strickland. It's a bad business, old lady, said he. Men don't climb up into the roofs of their bungalows to die, and they don't fasten up the ceiling cloth behind them. Let's think it out. Let's think it out somewhere else, I said. Excellent idea. Turn the lamps out. We'll get into my room. I did not turn the lamps out. I went into Strickland's room first and allowed him to make the darkness. Then he followed me, and we lit tobacco and thought. Strickland thought. I smoked furiously because I was afraid. Imray is back, said Strickland. The question is, who killed Imray? Don't talk. I've a notion of my own. When I took this bungalow, I took over most of Imray's servants. Imray was guileless and inoffensive, wasn't he? I agreed, though the heap under the cloth had looked neither one thing nor the other. If I call in all the servants, they will stand fast in a crowd and lie like Aryans. What do you suggest?" "Call them in one by one," I said. "They'll run away and give the news to all their fellows," said Strickland. "We must segregate 'em. Do you suppose your servant knows anything about it?" "He may, for aught I know, but I don't think it's likely. He has only been here 2 or 3 days," I answered. "What's your notion?" "I can't quite tell. How the dickens did the man get the wrong side of the ceiling cloth?" There was a heavy coughing outside Strickland's bedroom door. This showed that Bahadur Khan, his body servant, had waked from sleep and wished to put Strickland to bed. "Come in," said Strickland. "It's a very warm night, isn't it?" Bahadur Khan, a great green-turbaned 6-foot Mohammedan, said that it was a very warm night, but that there was more rain pending, which, by his honour's favour, would bring relief to the country. "It will be so, if God pleases," said Strickland, tugging off his boots. "It is in my mind, Bahadur Khan, that I have worked thee remorselessly for many days, ever since that time when thou first camest into my service. What time was that?" "Has the heaven-born forgotten? It was when Imray Sahib went secretly to Europe without warning given, and I, even I, came into the honoured service of the protector of the poor." "And Imray Sahib went to Europe?" "It is said so among those who were his servants." "And thou wilt take service with him when he returns?" "Assuredly, Sahib. He was a good master and cherished his dependents." "That is true. I am very tired, but I go buck-shooting tomorrow. Give me the little sharp rifle that I use for black buck. It is in the case yonder." The man stooped over the case, handed barrel, stock, and fore-end to Strickland, who fitted all together, yawning dolefully. Then he reached down to the gun case, took a solid-drawn cartridge, and slipped it into the breech of the 360 Express. "And Imray Sahib has gone to Europe secretly. That is very strange, Bahadur Khan, is it not?" "What do I know of the ways of the white man, heaven-born?" "Very little, truly. But thou shalt know more anon. It has reached me that Imray Sahib has returned from his so long journeyings, and that even now he lies in the next room, waiting his servant." "Sahib?" The lamplight slid along the barrels of the rifle as they levelled themselves at Bahadur Khan's broad breast. "Go and look," said Strickland. "Take a lamp. Thy master is tired, and he wants thee. Go." The man picked up a lamp and went into the dining room, Strickland following and almost pushing him with the muzzle of the rifle. He looked for a moment at the black depths behind the ceiling cloth, at the writhing snake underfoot, and last, a grey glaze settling on his face, at the thing under the tablecloth. "Hast thou seen?" said Strickland after a pause. "I have seen. I am clay in the white man's hands. What does the presence do?" "Hang thee within the month. What else?" "For killing him? Nay, Sahib, consider. Walking among us, his servants, he cast his eyes upon my child, who was 4 years old. Him he bewitched, and in 10 days he died of the fever, my child." "What said Imray Sahib?" "He said he was a handsome child, and patted him on the head, wherefore my child died. Wherefore I killed Imray Sahib in the twilight, when he had come back from office and was sleeping. Wherefore I dragged him up into the roof beams and made all fast behind him. The heaven-born knows all things. I am the servant of the heaven-born." Strickland looked at me above the rifle and said, in the vernacular, "Thou art witness to the saying? He has killed." Bahadur Khan stood ashen-grey in the light of the one lamp. The need for justification came upon him very quickly. "I am trapped," he said, "but the offence was that man's. He cast an evil eye upon my child, and I killed and hid him. Only such as are served by devils," he glared at Tietjens couched stolidly before him, "only such could know what I did." "It was clever," but thou shouldst have lashed him to the beam with a rope. Now thou thyself wilt hang by a rope. Orderly! A drowsy policeman answered Strickland's call. He was followed by another, and Tietjen sat wondrous still. "Take him to the police station," said Strickland. "There is a case toward." "Do I hang, then?" said Bahadur Khan, making no attempt to escape and keeping his eyes on the ground. "If the sun shines or the water runs, yes," said Strickland. Bahadur Khan stepped back one long pace, quivered, and stood still. The two policemen waited further orders. "Go," said Strickland.
"Nay, but I go very swiftly," said Bahadur Khan. "Look, I am even now a dead man." He lifted his foot, and to the little toe there clung the head of the half-killed snake, firm fixed in the agony of death. "I come of landholding stock," said Bahadur Khan, rocking where he stood. "It were a disgrace to me to go to the public scaffold. Therefore I take this way. Be it remembered that the Sahib's shirts are correctly enumerated, and that there is an extra piece of soap in his wash basin. My child was bewitched, and I slew the wizard. Why should you seek to slay me with the rope? My honor is saved, and I die."
At the end of an hour, he died, as they die who are bitten by a little brown kite, and the policeman bore him and the thing under the tablecloth to their appointed places. All were needed to make clear the disappearance of Imray. "This," said Strickland very calmly as he climbed into bed, "is called the 19th century. Did you hear what the man said?" "I heard," I answered. "Imray made a mistake, simply and solely through not knowing the nature of the Oriental, and the coincidence of a little seasonal fever. Bahadur Khan had been with him for 4 years. I shuddered. My own servant had been with me for exactly that length of time. When I went over to my own room, I found my man waiting, impassive as the copper head on a penny, to pull off my boots. "What has befallen Bahadur Khan?" said I.
"He was bitten by a snake and died. The rest the Sahib knows,"
was the answer. "And how much of this matter hast thou known?"
"As much as might be gathered from one coming in the twilight to seek satisfaction. Gently, Sahib. Let me pull off those boots."
I had just settled to the sleep of exhaustion when I heard Strickland shouting from his side of the house, "Tietjens has come back to her place!" And so she had. The great deer-hound was couched stately on her own bedstead, on her own blanket, while in the next room the idle, empty ceiling-cloth waggled as it trailed on the table. End of Side 2.